The clatter of forks and the low hum of conversation filled the small New York diner until a sound no one expected cut through the air. Not a gunshot, not a crash, but the broken sob of an 82-year-old billionaire. Margaret Whitmore, the woman who had commanded empires, silenced governments, and made fortunes shift with a single word, sat in the corner booth with tears streaming down her lined cheeks. The boardrooms that had once trembled at her gaze could never have imagined this scene. Her diamond ring flashed under the diner's warm lamplight as she raised a trembling hand toward the young waitress standing before her. Clara Evans, exhausted from a double shift, had leaned down to refill a water glass when the light revealed the silver star-shaped locket resting against her chest. Margaret's entire world collapsed in that instant. Her voice, usually sharp as steel, cracked into a whisper. "That necklace? Where did you get it?" Clara blinked, startled, her hand instinctively covering the locket. "It was my mother's," she said softly. "She told me never to part with it." The room seemed to shrink, every sound fading into silence as Margaret's grief poured out. She knew that necklace. Richard, her late husband, had it made by a master silversmith in Italy 30 years ago. There had only ever been one. The same necklace she had given her daughter Isabella before the night she stormed out and disappeared forever. Now here it was, resting against the chest of a waitress who looked confused and frightened by the intensity of Margaret's reaction. Diners stared, whispering. Margaret, the billionaire untouchable, was crumbling like a lost child, reaching not for power or profit, but for the truth that a single necklace had dragged back from the shadows of the past. The diner was nothing special, a narrow corner place with cracked red booths, sticky tables, and the faint smell of coffee that had been brewing since dawn. Yet for Clara Evans, it was the center of her survival. At 28, she had traded dreams for double shifts, carrying trays heavier than her shoulders should bear. Her brown hair pulled into a ponytail that always frayed by the end of the night. Every dollar she earned stretched between rent, utilities, and caring for her 6-year-old son, Ethan. The star-shaped silver locket she wore was the only luxury she possessed, and even that was no luxury at all. It was her mother's last gift, a piece of tarnished beauty she never took off. She had grown up believing it was simply a family keepsake, something sentimental that had survived through years of hardship. She had no idea it was a key to a past far greater and far darker than she imagined. Margaret Whitmore was a woman from another universe entirely. At 82, she was still sharp, still commanding, her name synonymous with wealth and influence. She lived in a world of marble floors, private jets, and hushed meetings that decided the future of industries. But once a month she escaped that sterile empire. She sent away her driver, slipped into an ordinary black sedan, and came alone to this diner. It wasn't the food she came for, it was memory. This was the place where she and her late husband Richard had shared their first date. Two ambitious dreamers sitting in a booth and planning a future they would eventually conquer together. Richard had been gone for 10 years, but in the cracked vinyl booths and greasy plates, Margaret still felt his laughter echo. She had sat in that corner booth countless times, clutching grief like an old companion, never expecting the past to walk straight up to her table. When Clara leaned forward to pour water, the lamplight revealed the locket. Margaret's heart stopped. She recognized it instantly. The Polaris locket Richard had designed and given to her on their 10th anniversary. The very same she had passed down to her daughter Isabella. Isabella, who had stormed out after a terrible fight and never returned. 30 years of silence, of endless searching, of private investigators who found nothing, of restless nights staring at an empty nursery, now shattered by a single glint of silver on a waitress's chest. Margaret's composure cracked in an instant. The cold steel matriarch the world knew dissolved into a trembling mother haunted by regret. "Please," she whispered, leaning across the table, her hands shaking. "Tell me your mother's name." Clara hesitated, caught between confusion and alarm. Her name was Isabella, Isabella Evans. The name hit Margaret like a thunderclap. Her world tilted. Isabella, her lost daughter. The necklace had not lied. The weary young waitress standing before her was not a stranger. She was family, The granddaughter Margaret had been mourning without even knowing. The air in the Whitmore mansion was thick with disbelief. Clara sat stiffly in a high-backed chair, her son Ethan curled against her side, eyes wide at the grandeur around him. Margaret had brought her here straight from the diner, unable to let her out of sight, desperate to cling to the fragile thread of family she had just rediscovered. For Clara, it was overwhelming, surreal. The marble floors, chandeliers, and oil portraits all spoke of a world she had never belonged to. For Margaret, it was a fragile hope, the possibility that the years of grief and silence could be healed. That hope shattered when the double doors of the library swung open. Edward Whitmore entered with the precision of a man accustomed to control. Tall, impeccably dressed in a bespoke navy suit, his face bore his mother's sharp angles, but none of her warmth. Behind him glided his wife Victoria, her diamond necklace catching the firelight, her lips curved in a smile that never touched her cold, appraising eyes. They paused at the sight of Clara, a waitress in a faded uniform, sitting amidst the grandeur of their legacy. Edward's brow furrowed, his voice clipped. "Mother, who is this?" Margaret rose slowly, her fingers still trembling from the revelation at the diner. "Edward, this is Clara Evans. She is Isabella's daughter." The words hung in the air like a detonation. Edward's expression hardened, shifting from suspicion to scorn. Victoria let out a small, incredulous laugh. "Isabella's daughter? After 30 years? Really, Margaret, have you lost all sense?" "She wears the Polaris locket," Margaret insisted, her voice breaking with emotion. "Richard designed it. I gave it to Isabella. There is no other in the world." Victoria stepped closer, peering at the tarnished silver charm with disdain. "A necklace proves nothing. Trinkets can be stolen, copied. This woman is clearly an opportunist who saw a story and decided to play her part." Clara felt her cheeks burn. She hadn't asked for any of this. She had been pouring water, working her shift, and now she was being accused of scheming for money she had never even imagined. She stood, her voice trembling but firm. "I didn't come here looking for you. I didn't even know who you were until tonight." My mother never spoke of her past. She told me my father died before I was born and that her parents were gone. I've lived my whole life in the dark. Edward waved a dismissive hand, as though brushing aside an inconvenience. "How convenient. A sob story to melt our mother's heart. But I see it for what it is. Manipulation. You appear out of nowhere armed with a necklace and a tail, and suddenly you're family?" Margaret's voice cut through his accusations, trembling but fierce. "Edward, watch your words. This is my granddaughter." "Alleged granddaughter," Victoria corrected smoothly, her eyes glinting with cruelty. "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. If she is who she says she is, then a DNA test will confirm it. Until then, she is nothing but a distraction." Clara's heart pounded. She looked from Edward's cold glare to Victoria's icy smirk, and then to Margaret's tear-streaked face. It was as though she were on trial, the jury already biased against her. Ethan clung tighter to her, sensing her distress. Clara drew herself up, her voice steady despite the storm inside. "I don't want your money. I don't want your empire. I want the truth about my mother. And if a test is what it takes to silence your doubt, then fine. Do it. I have nothing to hide." Edward's lips curved into a thin smile, a predator who believed he had cornered his prey. "Good. Then we'll see exactly who you are." The clash was set. For Clara, it was no longer just about a necklace. It was about her dignity, her identity, and her son's future. For Edward and Victoria, it was about power and inheritance. The battle lines had been drawn, and the war for the Whitmore legacy had only just begun. The Whitmore mansion had always been a fortress of polished marble and old money, but in the days following Clara's arrival, it began to feel like a battlefield. Margaret, fragile yet determined, spent every possible moment with her granddaughter, showing her family albums, telling her stories of Isabella, and holding Ethan on her lap as if trying to reclaim the years she had lost. For the first time in decades, a light returned to her tired eyes. But in another wing of the house, Edward and Victoria were plotting. To them, Clara was not a granddaughter, not a human being. She was a threat, a walking disaster that could shatter the dynasty they had worked their entire lives to control. Victoria's voice was sharp as she paced their gilded sitting room. her diamond bracelets clinking like chains. She's manipulating your mother. Look at her, coming from nothing, pretending to be noble, when all she wants is access to what's ours. If we let this go on, Edward, she'll be written into the will before the month is over. Edward's face was a mask of icy determination, his jaw tight. Not if we discredit her first. Mother's blinded by sentiment, but sentiment is fragile. If we plant enough doubt, even she will hesitate. And how do you plan to do that? Victoria asked, though her sly smile already suggested she had an idea. We find her weakness. Everyone who struggles leaves something behind. Debts, mistakes, secrets. And if she has none, we create one. Edward's eyes narrowed. Who? Victoria's lips curved into a predatory grin. Robert Kavanaugh, the best private investigator money can buy, and the dirtiest. He doesn't just find skeletons, he knows how to plant them. Within 24 hours, Robert Kavanaugh had Clara's entire life spread across his desk. Rent receipts, utility bills, pay stubs from waitressing jobs, a stack of medical forms for Ethan, all painfully ordinary. She had no arrests, no lawsuits, no scandals. She was maddeningly clean, but clean records only made Kavanaugh more creative. He found a small detail, a minor car accident 2 years earlier. Clara had been sideswiped by a reckless driver named Patrick Doyle. Insurance had covered it, but Doyle had made a scene at the time, shouting accusations in the street before storming off. Kavanaugh reached out to him, sliding a thick envelope of cash across a greasy diner table. Doyle's eyes lit up like a man drowning, offered a rope. For the right price, he would rewrite history. Soon, a sworn affidavit appeared on Victoria's desk, neatly typed and notarized. In it, Patrick Doyle claimed Clara had been drinking the night of the accident, her breath reeking of alcohol. When he threatened to call the police, she had allegedly offered him $500 in cash to keep quiet. The story was a lie, but it was plausible. It's perfect, Victoria said, eyes gleaming with triumph as she held up the document. Not enough to put her in prison, but enough to smear her reputation, to turn her from a poor little victim into a scheming fraud. Edward allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Mother built her empire on contracts and credibility. Once she sees this, she'll question everything about Clara. Doubt spreads like wildfire. They rehearsed the timing carefully. They would not reveal the evidence immediately. No, they would wait until the DNA test results arrived. If the science confirmed Clara as Isabella's daughter, they would deliver the blow in the very moment of victory, twisting triumph into disgrace. It was psychological warfare, and they intended to win. Meanwhile, Clara remained unaware of the storm gathering against her. She was overwhelmed enough by the mansion, by Margaret's kindness, by the surreal shift from scraping by on tips to sitting at a mahogany dining table beneath crystal chandeliers. She tucked Ethan into bed each night, whispering reassurances she barely believed herself. We're safe, she told him softly, smoothing his hair. But in her heart, she knew nothing about this world was safe. And in another wing of the house, her enemies were sharpening their knives, ready to strike the moment she thought she had finally found a family. The library was suffocating with tension. Heavy velvet curtains blocked the afternoon sun, leaving the room lit only by the golden glow of the chandelier above the mahogany table. Margaret sat in her grand armchair, her face pale but resolute. Clara sat on a smaller sofa with Ethan pressed close beside her, the little boy clutching a teddy bear Margaret had given him only yesterday. Across from them, Edward and Victoria sat like opposing counsel in a courtroom, their eyes cold, their expressions unreadable. Mr. Sullivan, the family lawyer, entered with a sealed envelope in his hands. The hush that fell over the room was absolute. Good afternoon, he said calmly. I have the results of the DNA test comparing Miss Clara Evans with Mrs. Margaret Whitmore. He broke the seal, unfolding a single sheet of paper. Every breath in the room seemed to pause as he read. The probability of grand maternity is 99.99%, Mr. Sullivan announced. There is no scientific doubt. Ms. Evans is the biological granddaughter of Mrs. Whitmore, daughter of the late Isabella Evans. For a moment, the world itself seemed to exhale. Margaret's face broke into radiant relief, tears slipping down her cheeks as she reached for Clara's hands. I knew it, she whispered, her voice trembling with joy. I knew it in my soul. Clara felt her chest swell with vindication. For once, the weight of suspicion lifted. She glanced at Ethan, who smiled shyly, sensing his mother's happiness. For the first time in her life, she belonged. But across the table, Victoria's smile was a blade. She rose gracefully, a slim folder in her hand. "How touching," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "But before we all celebrate this fairy tale reunion, perhaps we should consider who exactly we are welcoming into this family." Margaret's smile faltered. "What are you doing, Victoria?" "Due diligence," Victoria replied coolly. "While we awaited the DNA results, Edward and I hired a private investigator. And what he uncovered is illuminating." She opened the folder, pulling out a document. 2 years ago, Ms. Evans was in a car accident. The other driver, Patrick Doyle, now provides a sworn affidavit claiming Clara was intoxicated at the scene and attempted to bribe him with cash to avoid police involvement. She held the paper aloft as though it were gospel. "This is the kind of woman you're about to elevate into our family." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She shot to her feet, her face blazing with indignation. "That's a lie! That man screamed at me on the street, but I wasn't drinking. I never offered him money. This is fabricated." Edward stood smoothly, his voice calm, patronizing. "Of course you deny it, but people who struggle the way you have, desperation leads to poor choices. And bribery, while not a felony here, speaks volumes about character." Clara's breath came fast, her hands shaking. She looked desperately at Margaret. "Please, you have to believe me. I've worked my entire life to keep my son safe. I would never, never do something like that." But Margaret's face had gone rigid. The joy of a moment ago was clouded by doubt. Her eyes flickered between Clara and the damning affidavit, her mind battling grief, hope, and suspicion. Edward pressed the advantage, his voice low and cutting. "Mother, you built this empire on integrity. If this story breaks, Billionaire's long-lost granddaughter accused of DUI bribery, it will stain the Whitmore name forever. You cannot let sentiment blind you to reality." Clara's throat closed, tears of fury burning her eyes. She turned to Margaret, her voice breaking. "You believe them? After the DNA, after everything?" Margaret's silence was worse than any accusation. The seed of doubt had been planted, the room fractured in an instant, the reunion poisoned, the truth buried beneath lies. Clara gathered Ethan into her arms, her voice trembling with resolve. "I don't want your money. I don't want any of this. All I wanted was to know who I was. But if all you see is a liar, then I'll go." And with her son clutching her hand, she turned and walked out of the library, her heart breaking as Edward and Victoria's satisfied smiles followed her like shadows. Clara's hands shook as she stuffed Ethan's clothes into their worn duffel bag. The guest suite, once a dream, now felt like a gilded cage of suspicion. Ethan hugged his teddy bear, confused by his mother's tears. "We're going home, sweetheart," Clara whispered, her voice raw. "Back to where people don't look at us like dirt." She zipped the bag shut, her heart pounding with both fury and grief. But as she opened the closet for one last check, her gaze fell on a battered cardboard box she had carried from her apartment. She had avoided it since arriving at the mansion. Now something compelled her to lift it down. Inside lay her mother's old sketchbooks, faded brushes, and, tucked beneath them, a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon. Clara's breath caught. The envelopes were all addressed in her mother's neat script. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore, Whitmore Estate, New York. None had ever been mailed. With trembling fingers, she opened the first. "Dearest Mother, I am sorry for the things I said. I was angry, but I never stopped loving you. Daniel and I are struggling but happy. Please, let us come home." Clara read through them, her chest tightening with each line. Letters of apology. Letters announcing her pregnancy. Pleas for help as Daniel grew ill. And then the final one, written in desperate ink. "Daniel is gone. I am alone and 7 months pregnant." I called the house. Julian answered. "He said you never wanted to see me again. He said you disowned me. Goodbye, Mother." The letter slipped from Clara's fingers. Horror rooted her to the spot. It hadn't been fate or silence or neglect. It had been Edward. He had intercepted the calls, lied to Isabella, cut her off from her family, and let her die believing she was unwanted. A surge of rage and vindication burned through Clara. She grabbed the letters and stormed down the hall just as Margaret appeared, breathless and distraught. "Clara, please don't leave," she begged. "I was wrong to doubt you." Clara thrust the final letter into her grandmother's hands. "Read this." Margaret's eyes scanned the words, her face collapsing into anguish. She clutched the paper to her chest, a guttural cry tearing from her throat. Then her grief transformed into something harder, sharper. Rage, with fire blazing in her eyes, she strode into the grand hall where Edward and Victoria lingered, smug in their apparent victory. Clara followed, clutching Ethan's hand. "You!" Margaret hissed, her voice trembling with fury. She raised the letter like a weapon. "You did this. You intercepted her calls. You told her she was disowned. You let your sister die alone." Edward's face drained of color. "Mother, that's not—" Slap! The crack of Margaret's hand echoed through the marble chamber. "Do not speak," she spat. "For 30 years, your father and I grieved, thinking our daughter abandoned us. But she tried, she begged to come home. And you, my son, you lied to us all. You killed her as surely as if you'd held the knife." Victoria stepped forward, her mask of composure faltering. "Margaret, please, surely you don't believe—" "Silence!" Margaret's voice thundered, every inch the titan of industry who had cowed boardrooms. "I see you both now for what you are. Parasites feeding on this family's name. You will have nothing." Edward's panic broke through his icy facade. "Mother, think rationally. This will destroy the company." "No, Edward," Margaret said, her voice like steel. "It will save it. Mr. Sullivan will oversee your removal as CEO effective immediately. You are disinherited. Pack your things. Get out." Victoria's face twisted, her carefully constructed poise cracking into pure venom. "You can't erase us that easily." "Watch me," Margaret snarled. "This house, this company, this legacy, none of it belongs to you anymore." Security staff appeared at the edges of the hall, summoned silently by Mr. Harrison, the loyal butler who had seen everything. Edward and Victoria, stripped of their power, had no choice but to leave. Their departure was swift and humiliating, their empire of greed collapsing in a single night. The hall grew silent once more. Margaret turned to Clara, her body trembling, her face lined with grief and exhaustion. "I failed your mother," she whispered, "but I will not fail you, or Ethan. Not again." Clara's eyes blurred with tears as Margaret pulled her into a fierce embrace. For the first time, justice had pierced the rot that had poisoned the Whitmore family for decades. The lies were gone, the guilty cast out. What remained was fragile, wounded, but real. A family rebuilt from ashes. The days that followed were quieter, as though the mansion itself was taking a long, weary breath after decades of secrets and betrayal. Edward and Victoria were gone, their absence leaving not a void but a sense of cleansing, as though poison had finally been drained. In their place, something new began to take root. Clara and Ethan no longer felt like guests. They felt like family. Margaret, though aged and burdened with grief, walked the halls with a renewed purpose. The light had returned to her eyes, not the cold gleam of power, but the warmth of a grandmother who had been given a second chance. She spent mornings with Ethan, teaching him chess on the same set Richard had once used with Isabella. Afternoons were for stories in the sunlit garden, where Clara discovered her mother's art supplies and, for the first time in years, picked up a pencil to sketch. She drew Ethan chasing butterflies, Margaret smiling softly in her armchair, even Mr. Harrison cracking a rare grin as he watched the boy play. The house, once a shrine to wealth, slowly became a home again. One evening, Clara found Margaret by the fireplace holding the silver Polaris locket. Her hands trembled as she fastened it around Clara's neck. "This locket was mine," she said softly. "Then it was Isabella's. Now it is yours. Not as a reminder of all that was lost, but as a promise of what we found again." Clara touched the star, feeling the cool metal against her skin, her throat tight with emotion. "I don't care about the fortune," she whispered. "I only care that Ethan will grow up knowing where he comes from, and that he is loved." Margaret cupped her cheek with a hand that shook but was steady in its intent. "And he will, I promise you that. You both are my family, my heart. Everything else is meaningless without that." Tears shimmered in Clara's eyes, but they were no longer tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, of healing. Ethan, curled up nearby, looked between them and smiled, sensing even at his young age that something broken had been mended. In the weeks that followed, Clara's life transformed, not because of money or status, but because of love restored. The bitterness of doubt gave way to the sweetness of belonging. The mansion echoed not with the cold shuffle of business deals, but with laughter, stories, and the kind of warmth that no fortune could ever buy. For Margaret, it was redemption. For Clara, it was discovery. And for Ethan, it was the gift of a family he never knew he had. In the end, the silver locket was not just a piece of jewelry. It was a compass, a guiding star that had led them through shadows of grief, lies, and betrayal into the light of forgiveness and second chances. And so the woman who once ruled the world with power finally found her true kingdom, not in boardrooms or bank accounts, but in the hearts of those she loved.